today's World Insight. History's cutthroat Cold War politics revisited 6 decades since the Cuban Missile Crisis. What does history teach us about the risks of Cold War confrontation? How do they figure in today's geopolitical tensions, especially between China and the United States?
Welcome to World Insight. Nearly 60 years ago, the United States and its then rival, the former Soviet Union, had their riskiest confrontation over Soviet missiles in Cuba. Then U.S. President John Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba over perceived threats of the missiles, which lie 90 miles off the east coast of the U.S. Soviet-U.S. Cold War may spiral into a devastating nuclear conflict. It was a jarring wake-up call for both sides and many others around the world. 6 decades later, echoes of cold relations, this time between the United States and China, some argue. So what are the crucial lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis? If we did not learn from history, do we inevitably repeat it? Let's ask our panelists. In Wyoming, I'm joined by Robert Ross, Associate of the John King Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies from Harvard University. Also in the U.S., in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedashian, Professor of History from American University. In Shanghai, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics with East China Normal University. Last but not least, also in Shanghai, Shending Li, Professor from the Institute of International Studies with Fudan University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. It's 60th anniversary already of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world is once again falling into a lot of uncertainties. Tell me more about what is your takeaway of that event 60 years ago, Mr. Ross?
Well, the most important takeaway is that these two great superpowers managed to avoid a nuclear war despite the intense conflict of interest between the two of them. Both sides recognized that war would serve neither country's purpose, and both sides were able to make compromises and reflect the other's interests in their own policy. Because of mutual compromise and putting the other in one's own foot, in looking at the other's conditions, we were able to compromise. Those kind of lessons, of course, were also apparent in 1971-72 when the United States and China had a rapprochement. And again, the two sides were able to look at each other's interests and compromise. And so, if anything, the lessons from history, including Cuban Missile Crisis and more recently the Nixon rapprochement, is that if we recognize our two sides' interests, we can have a better relationship and minimize the likelihood of war.
Professor Fedashian, your takeaway?
Well, I agree with my colleague on the other side of the continent. The recognition of the unpleasant fact that great nations have vital national security interests, which, whether we like it or not, creates spheres of influence, is exactly what was on display during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the American president was willing to break international law by imposing a quarantine in international waters and even risk going to World War III. And the American public supported Kennedy because of Cuba, although it itself did not threaten the United States, but a Soviet presence there, especially with medium-range nuclear weapons, certainly was a threat to the United States. The American public supported its president, and it doesn't take a great leap of imagination to understand that the Chinese today are concerned about Taiwan in a fairly similar manner. Back then, there was sufficient political wisdom and diplomatic finesse on the part of Kennedy, by the way, more so than Khrushchev, to actually find a mutually convenient way out of the crisis. And I'm afraid that so far, with Ms. Pelosi's trip towards Taiwan, there's a bit less of that, at least on her part, in Washington.
Professor Mahoney, tell me more about your thoughts.
I would suggest that the lesson of the Cold War was never really learned. I think that what was done to Cuba over the last 6 decades by the U.S. Has been a gross injustice. I don't think it actually achieved durable, sustainable security, certainly not for the Cubans. So my take would be, unfortunately, the tough lessons were never learned from the U.S. Vis-a-vis the Cold War. First, the U.S. has romanticized the Cold War as a complete American victory. This is a metaphysical characterization, one that links directly with the metaphysics that so many Americans believe about the U.S., that it's the best, most righteous, most God-favored nation in the world, and that it will always win due to its superior systems and principles. In fact, the Soviet Union collapsed because of its own internal shortcomings and failed foreign policies, and some believe the U.S. today is similarly at risk due to its own systemic crises at home and abroad. But the second issue here, the other tough lesson learned from the Cold War that the U.S. hasn't absorbed, is the experience of global hegemony of the U.S. as a superpower and then as a sole superpower after the Soviet collapse. That this sort of zero-sum thinking is not only destructive for whoever is targeted, it's also self-defeating and even potentially catastrophic for everyone around the world.
They say history is always being repeated, and yet in this case, there seems to be some parallel and at the same time differences. For example, Cuba is a sovereign country. Of course, Taiwan, according to the One China principle, One China policy, it's all one China. And meanwhile, the role of the United States and the role of the former Soviet Union, whether that role the U.S. had then is still the role the U.S. had now, it's very questionable. But let me go to you, Professor Shen. What is takeaway for you as a Chinese scholar?
I have two catchwords. The first is crisis management. When the Cuban Missile Crisis has occurred, the leader of the then Soviet Union and America, they have had a dialogue. And then they managed successfully to reduce the tension by giving face to each other and by giving substance to each other. That is Mr. Khrushchev took a courageous effort to withdraw Soviet nuclear missile from the territory of Cuba. That could be viewed a lot of losing faith, because that kind of deployment is not illegal by any international law between two sovereign countries. But in reality, that has been deployed to a place too close to America. America would feel severe threat, situational threat, or physical threat. So Soviet Union, I think I would give great commend to Mr. Khrushchev by taking this away. That would be viewed as a losing face. But America also took its courageous effort. That has not been publicized enough, which is to meet the demand of the Soviet Union by withdrawing American nuclear-tipped missile from a neighbor of the Soviet Union, namely Turkey. This great mutual concession has helped to dissolve the tension. The second catchword is crisis prevention. From beginning, U.S. should not deploy nuclear weapons to a place so close to Soviet Union. I think President George Bush has done well. At the end of the Cold War, he withdrew all U.S. tactical nuclear weapons from overseas, from South Korea. And from when China-U.S. established a diplomatic relationship, the then U.S. president withdrew U.S. nuclear weapons from Taiwan. That's great. That helped to be American to be viewed as not that hostile.
Very briefly, Professor Fidashin, since you've been doing research about Russia over the decade, tell me more about your quick response to what Professor Shen from Shanghai had to say.
I think he's right in the sense that both sides were willing to compromise. Of course, part of the problem for the Soviets is that Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev did not have a plan B for the eventuality that the Americans discovered the missiles before they were actually placed. But those are details. The point is that there was political will. And the reason why in my early comments, my opening comments, I gave Kennedy a good chunk of the credit is because it was the Kennedy administration that really decided to reach out through backdoor channels, and we know this from numerous memoirs, and to offer this quid pro quo that my colleague in Shanghai just mentioned, the removal of missiles from Cuba and from Turkey at the same time. There was political will to settle this, even if it was under the table, so to speak. We'll see if there's any of that happening right now.
Earlier, many of our panelists mentioned about the consensus in the United States then to support a president who tried to cool down the situation rather than escalate the situation. The question now is, in the U.S., are the political parties big enough, powerful enough to be able to rein in some of the opportunists within the political parties, and whether this administration is strong enough to fend off some of the opportunistic actions and rhetorics coming from certain members of either political parties?
Regarding the American political system, I don't think that any restraint on the part of the American president or Nancy Pelosi will go uncriticized, quite harshly, by the Republicans. And so any restraint on the part of the United States regarding Pelosi's visit or potential visit would incur a high political cost for the Democratic Party. Having said that, I also think it's quite clear that the president is not pleased with Senator Pelosi's behavior. She either consulted with the White House and chose to ignore their advice, or she did not consult with the White House, and they're not pleased with that either. Lack of support she has received from the White House is quite clear. And I think so. That's a signal, I think, to China that the United States is not bent on supporting whatever Taiwan policy that any American member of Congress wants to pursue. And I think there's also an upside also regarding Taiwan. The reluctance of the White House to support Nancy Pelosi also signals Taiwan that there are limits to American support, and that restraint on Taiwan's part is also in the American interest. And so that no one wants to see an incident over Senator Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. But as always, these things are complicated, and we should appreciate some of the positive signals that are coming out of Washington at the same time.
It's a very interesting point. Let me go to you, Professor Mahoney. Tell me more about how do you see American politics should avoid certain political figures using certain issues, even foreign policy issues, as a bargaining chip for his or her political career out of whatever purpose, so that it would not be used as an impression by others that the U.S. politics as a whole, Washington as a whole, is using certain international issues as, using certain foreign policy issues as a bargaining chip against a certain country.
I think a few issues here. Several, we go back 20, 30 years ago, there was a lot of sensitivity in China. There was a lot of misunderstanding about how the American system really worked. And anytime some congressperson took their own stand on Taiwan or some other issue, it would anger Beijing. And over time, China learned that you have to take some of these congressional figures with a grain of salt and focus on what's happening in the White House, because it's really the president who controls foreign policy, and in a way that's almost completely unchecked by the other branches of government. That said, the real problem with Biden and Pelosi here is that Biden has been pressing China on so many fronts that already crossing, we might argue, many of China's red lines, that he can't afford to have Pelosi crashing into his very delicate China policy at this time. So I don't think we can really let Biden off the hook. He has been causing a lot of trouble, and he's not necessarily the good guy here. Furthermore, historically, it was, I think, or at least it can be argued that it was the U.S. that was playing the responsible adult with Taiwan and saying, okay, you need to keep your independence rhetoric down. You need to not be too provocative. But I think we're reaching a point in time where there's sort of an infantilism in American politics, and it may be incumbent on Taiwan to be the adult here and say, uh-oh, maybe we better tell the U.S. to calm down. Maybe we should tell Pelosi not to come. It's not in our interest to see a crisis emerging here.
How do you see the issue of Taiwan now being read by China in this, what some Americans term as rivalry between China and the United States? And in that regard, how much grain of salt, borrowing words from our American colleagues, should the Chinese think about this issue with?
I think the fact that China-U.S. normalized their relationship has reflected the international politics of the Cold War. China-U.S. difference over this matter has never ended. But over time, China considers that I'm now somebody. You cannot treat me this way. You have to bear the consequences, like another Cuban crisis. That would also burn yourself to make yourself perish. So China tried to deliver this message whenever U.S. would question. I think this explains the current Pelosi crisis over.
How much the U.S. could still hold the Taiwan card or be able to appear on the international stage as if it is a fair party on the issue of Taiwan if it falls too much on one side or the other side of the issue? Professor Pidashian.
Right. Strategic ambiguity works when one of the parties, the one that's trying to play that game, doesn't have much to lose and has everything to gain by it. That may have been the case with the United States in relationship to other countries before, but I simply don't see how this can be useful to the United States currently in its relationship with China, and especially with Russia, because this strategic triangle, as many have called it, really is the dominant one for the continent of Eurasia. Some may argue for the world, but we'll leave that aside for now. If the United States wants to play the strategic ambiguity card and maybe even use this seeming disagreement between Biden and Pelosi over her trip to Taiwan, or maybe not trip to Taiwan. We'll see what actually happens in the next, 72, 96 hours. It's certainly not giving the United States any edge over its main, the problems, rather, that it's trying to deal with in Eurasia. Playing strategic ambiguity in relationship to China right now only drives the Chinese and the Russians together. And it's a mystery to me if all of this is some kind of plot and not just a dysfunction in Washington, of which there's plenty these days, how the United States expects to, on the one hand, play this card, the Taiwan card, against China, and then expect Janet Yellen to appeal to the Chinese to convince them to join some kind of oil cap, oil price cap with Russia, and to expect them to go along with her plans. So this strategic ambiguity doesn't seem to really apply here, or certainly isn't working in American geopolitical favor.
Mr. Ross, also help us to understand how is that strategic ambiguity still possible? Is this administration understand the essence of it, or is it still possible to do it?
I remember when George Herbert Walker Bush could not recite the exact phrase of American policy toward China, and his response was, "I do not do nuance." I think we can say the same about President Biden, is that the nuance of American policy toward China is lost on him. But then second, the nuances would subject him to perhaps criticism he doesn't want to accept. So at times, without thinking, he'll say things that are not American policy, and that does pertain to the issue of ambiguity. And the reality, of course, is that no matter what the American president says, No one knows what we will do in a crisis. No one knows what we will do in a war. So there is always going to be ambiguity. But the purpose of our declaratory policy of ambiguity is not just to reassure Beijing that we are not on Taiwan's side, but to caution Taiwan that they cannot count on us should they push Taiwan's red line. Push the mainland's red line. So ambiguity serves American purpose toward both Taiwan and the mainland. Indeed, we do need to remember that the likelihood that American support for Taiwan in a war in which the war is unprovoked, shall we say, diminishes increasingly. The rise of China makes America more cautious day by day.
Over the past time, the so-called strategic ambiguity may have helped Americans' interest to some extent, because it assured mainland China that the U.S. would not support Taiwan in it. And also, it assured Taiwan that if Taiwan would be hurt, America would most likely be on the side of Taiwan. But with mainland China's rapid rise, we think that the cross-Taiwan relationship has not been developed to an extent to integration, has hurt us. Therefore, we think if the U.S. continue to play this policy, we may think about our initiative to change it, to make the future reality over Taiwan issue be to favor our interest. Therefore, we would think even this strategic ambiguity does not serve China's interest. So we would push the U.S. to change. The U.S. is now being burnt to change, to support Taiwan openly, not a choice. To change, to abandon Taiwan, not a choice. The U.S. at this time has no good choice. And therefore, White House is continuing the strategic ambiguity with more sympathy and emphasis in favor of Taiwan. And Pelosi is worried that 10 years later, U.S. may have to change policy. Why not to play fair at this time?
Well, the bottom line is, as Beijing has repeatedly argued, the true guardrails of security of U.S.-China relations are the three joint communiques, the One China principle, and the disavowal of Taiwanese independence. And Biden has been accused by some in Beijing of hollowing out these foundations, these bedrock principles of China-U.S. relations. He certainly sent both equivocal and unequivocal messages while simultaneously undermining this strategic ambiguity. But I think the challenge presented by the U.S. is much bigger than the Taiwan issue. Biden, even more than Trump, is pressing China on multiple fronts. And doing so while describing China in adversarial terms, and sometimes even demonizing China in global discourse. And his proposal, that we can manage this in some way through occasional phone calls and perhaps meetings on the sidelines of international meetings, that we can keep these events from spiraling out of control, while increasing pressure on China. The other point was made. Okay, how do we deal with Yellen wanting cooperation on oil when we have to also deal with these issues that threaten sovereignty and security in Taiwan? So what we're seeing is, arguably, as Beijing worries, this hollowing out of the actual foundations of the relationship. And this has been rejected as unsustainable by Beijing. So, furthermore, given all that Biden is doing against China, it's not unreasonable. It's not unreasonable to suspect that his approach, right, even his saying maybe it's not a good idea for Pelosi to go, even though he shifts this blame to the military so he doesn't have to take full political ownership for it. Some people worry that this is just the U.S. trying to buy time while it repositions for an eventual confrontation, which many people predict in 5 or 10 years. And although the U.S. isn't ready for it right now, it certainly has some incentive to do it If it believes in this zero-sum game, it has some incentive to do it before too long, before Beijing surpasses the U.S. or equalizes the U.S. as an economic and military power.
Before we go, I would love to have all of you gentlemen to share with us a thought or two, very briefly, if you can, very briefly, about how do you hope situations would evolve in the next 4 or 5 days, let's just say within the next week, within the week. Let's go to Mr. Ross first.
I think Senator Pelosi has given herself a way out by simply saying that Taiwan was never on the schedule of the congressional delegation. The congressional delegation will not go to Taiwan, and she has no plans to travel alone.
All right.
This would be an ideal outcome, and I think we would be able to step back from this so-called crisis. And I think, indeed, it might also be a positive signal to the mainland and allow the mainland to breathe somewhat of a sigh of relief to know that despite however much the United States wants to use Taiwan in this new containment policy, there are indeed limits to American policy, an American understanding of the sensitivity of the issue, so as going forward, it will try and minimize the risk of crossing real red lines.
I think Professor Ross makes a very good point, but the problem is that the rhetoric around this, especially on the part of Nancy Pelosi and many Americans who defend her right to visit Taiwan, but seem to take no account of the responsibility for this, they may be on the losing side if what Professor Ross says, and what I agree with, by the way, actually ends up taking place, because it will have a political price for the Democrats to pay come the midterm elections.
Whatever happened, we should remember a nuclear war should never be fought and would never be. And between China and the U.S., we should never allow a chance for conventional conflict from. And in this stand, Madame Pelosi still has a great to do to bring benefits to all people across the Asia Pacific.
Yeah, my concern is, we all know the potential danger of Pelosi visits, but if she cancels her visit, she will likely, and probably be supported by Biden in this, in one form or another, likely argue that this is due to the aggressive and dangerous position that China represents to Taiwan, and this will further spur more action in the U.S. Against China vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. All the best. We hope for peace. And that's our discussion on the Cuban Missile Crisis and the lessons we should learn today. And of course, a follow-up debate about the issue of Taiwan. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.